The date is the 20th of February, 2026, and the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 13 at the Royal Courts of Justice in London have just sealed shut, signaling the end of a legal session that will likely be etched into the annals of British history, alongside the abdication of Edward VIII and the divorce of Charles and Diana. But outside, on the Strand, the air is thick with a different kind of tension. The echoes of what transpired within those wood-paneled walls are already reverberating around the globe with the force of a seismic event, toppling narratives and destroying reputations in seconds. For the past 5 years, Prince Harry has constructed a fortress around his life, a narrative bastion built on the singular foundation that the British press made his existence an absolute misery. He has flown across oceans, hired the most expensive legal teams in the hemisphere, and staked his entire reputation, his dwindling finances, and his fractured relationship with his family on the claim that he was the singular victim of a relentless, intrusive media machine. He promised a reckoning. He promised that the truth would come out and vindicate his exodus. But today, the narrative did not just shift. It was incinerated by the very fire he lit. In a moment that will be studied by historians, psychologists, and legal experts for decades to come, the Duke of Sussex sat in the witness box and listened as his own lawyer, in a catastrophic procedural necessity, handed the opposing counsel a sheaf of digital evidence that was never meant to see the light of day. The courtroom fell into a silence that was not merely quiet, but suffocating. It was the stillness of a room where everyone present, the judge, the barristers, the clerks, and the press realized they were witnessing the demolition of a human being in real time. It took only 11 words to dismantle the fairy tale that had been sold to the world for millions of dollars. 11 carefully chosen, devastatingly strategic words sent from a phone in Montecito to a confidant in Los Angeles. Judge Margaret Thornberry, a woman known for her steely demeanor and lack of theatricality, simply read them aloud from the evidentiary binder. Her voice was clinical, detached, and devoid of judgment, which somehow made the impact even worse. She adjusted her glasses and read the text message sent by Meghan Markle. "Make him tear up when discussing Diana. It plays well." Those words hung in the air like toxic smoke, poisoning the atmosphere of the court. They weren't shouted, they weren't dramatic, but in that sterile environment surrounded by the weight of British law and the ghosts of history, they became a weapon that cut through years of carefully constructed narrative like a scalpel through silk. And Prince Harry, the man who has built his entire post-royal identity on the sanctity of his mother's memory, the authenticity of his grief, and the protection of his family, did not just react, he shattered. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must visualize the scene with granular detail. Harry sat in the witness box, shoulders locked in a military posture he has maintained since his days at Sandhurst, a physical armor against the world. His jaw was set with the determination of a man fighting a crusade, convinced of his moral superiority. But when the judge reached that particular line in the evidence, something within him physically broke. His jaw twitched first, a subtle, almost imperceptible spasm that betrayed the chaos erupting behind his eyes. Then his hands, which had been resting calmly on his knees, curled into fists so tight that the knuckles turned bone white, the blood draining away as if in shock. His face, that famous face that has smiled from magazine covers and waved from palace balconies since birth, twisted with something far more primal than embarrassment or anger. It was raw, visceral, devastating pain. What happened next was a scene of such unfiltered vulnerability that even the hardened court reporters, veterans of murder trials and corruption scandals, stopped taking notes, their pens hovering over their pads. Harry lowered his head slowly, like a man trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear into the wood of the stand to escape the gaze of the gallery. He covered his face with both hands, shielding himself from the fluorescent lights, and then, in the awful, heavy silence of the courtroom, came a sound that no one expected. It was a sob. It was guttural, broken, and terrifyingly real. This was not the polished emotion of a public figure wiping away a single tear during a scheduled interview with Oprah Winfrey or Anderson Cooper, complete with lighting adjustments and makeup touch-ups. This was the sound of a man discovering in real time that the worst fear he had buried in the darkest corners of his mind was actually true. The woman he had fought the world for, the woman he had burned his family to protect, the woman he worshipped, had turned his deepest trauma into a bullet point on a branding strategy document. The betrayal that led to this moment is Shakespearean in its scope, a tragedy of trust misplaced and loyalty weaponized. These text messages were never supposed to see daylight. They were private conversations between Meghan Markle and a trusted friend from her California days, someone she had known since her acting career, someone she confided in about everything from wardrobe choices to media strategy, or so she thought. That friend, whose name has been shielded by the court under the pseudonym Witness X, but whose identity is the subject of feverish speculation ranging from former co-stars to discarded stylists, had quietly cooperated with the defense. It was the betrayal within the betrayal, but what she had handed over wasn't just gossip or venting or complaints about the weather. It was something far more calculated, far more chilling. It was the blueprint of the Sussex operation. Judge Thornberry had warned the gallery earlier that morning that the messages contained graphic implications. She clarified that this was not sexual content, but something potentially more damaging, evidence of systematic manipulation. The defense argued that this evidence proved their pattern of destroying evidence and concealing unlawful behavior continued into the litigation itself. What the courtroom was about to hear would paint not the vulnerable Duchess, driven out by a hostile press and cold institutions, but a strategist, a tactician, a brand manager orchestrating the most high-stakes personal rebrand of the decade. And at the center of it all was Harry's most sacred grief, his mother Diana. The implication of the message, "Make him tear up when discussing Diana," is not subtle. It suggests that Harry's grief, the trauma that has defined him since he was 12 years old walking behind a coffin, the wound that has shaped his entire life, had been prepped. It suggests it was scripted. It suggests it was staged not for healing, but for headlines. For Harry, who has spoken endlessly about the click and flash of cameras triggering his PTSD, to realize that his own wife was directing those flashes for maximum impact is a psychological blow from which recovery seems impossible. It reframes every interview, every documentary confession, every moment of vulnerability he has shared with the world, not as an act of bravery, but as a scene in a play he didn't know he was acting in. It meant that his pain was her currency, traded on the open market of public sympathy. For the next 4 hours, Prince Harry didn't speak a single word. He sat in that witness box, face flushed, eyes swollen, hands trembling, while message after message was read aloud. Each one landed like a physical blow, stripping away another layer of his reality. Some messages were subtle, hints at controlling the narrative. Others were surgical, precise instructions on how to behave. Together, they painted a portrait too complex and too cruel to deny. One text from Meghan referred to a private family dinner as a goldmine of reactive content, viewing a meal not as a family gathering but as a data collection exercise. Another described her plans to bake empathy into Harry's next public appearance, treating his emotional state as an ingredient in a recipe that needed to be measured perfectly. Then came one that made the room freeze, a sentence so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the chamber. "He wears grief like silk. We just need the right lighting." Think about that phrase, grief like silk. It reduces a person's deepest trauma to a texture, a costume, a fabric, to be draped and lit for the cameras. It implies that his sadness is an accessory that makes him look better, more sympathetic, more marketable. Even veteran reporters who had covered wars sat slack-jawed at the cynicism. This wasn't just a reputation being dismantled. This was a worldview being destroyed in real time. The court then entered what the defense called the narrative construction and manipulation phase. It began with messages relating to Harry's therapy disclosures during the Oprah interview. Everyone remembers that interview, the raw honesty about feeling trapped. But Meghan's private texts dissected his language like a director reviewing an actor's performance. She wrote, "Good. That line about trapped in the system landed well, but next time pause longer before saying, 'I couldn't even call my grandmother. It needs space to breathe.'" There were rehearsals. Whole paragraphs that appeared nearly verbatim in their interviews were now traced back to Meghan's drafts. Drafts with annotations like, Insert breath here for emotion catch, or glance down and rub fingers when saying my brother stopped taking my calls. Each revelation chipped away at something Harry believed was sacred. He shifted in his seat, his back stiffening, then slouching, then sagging entirely as the weight of the manipulation crushed him. At one point, he rubbed his face so hard it left red streaks across his cheeks, a physical manifestation of his desire to wake up. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently, likely advising him to compose himself, but Harry didn't respond. He looked like a man trying to physically retreat from his own skin, trying to escape the body that had been used as a prop. 2 hours into the presentation, the courtroom air had become unbearably heavy. That is when Judge Thornberry read the message that silenced even the legal teams. Meghan wrote, "He still wants their approval. It's pathetic, but I can use it. The guilt over his mother makes him easy to redirect. That's the engine." Someone in the back row whispered a curse before catching themselves. Harry flinched, but he didn't sob this time. He just closed his eyes, then opened them again, slower, more hollow, like something had shut off behind them. It was as if a flame had been extinguished, the light of belief snuffing out in the cold wind of facts. His security detail exchanged glances. One officer took a subtle step forward, another unhooked a water bottle. They didn't act, but they were ready for a physical collapse. When the judge asked if he needed a recess, Harry didn't answer verbally. He simply nodded. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't defeat. It was emptiness. It was the nod of a man whose decisions had all been taken from him by timing, by evidence, by someone he had trusted more than life itself. After a 30-minute break, Harry returned physically present, but emotionally absent. His gait had slowed, the bounce gone from his step. His eyes were rimmed with red. His suit jacket hung off him like borrowed fabric, as if he had shrunk in the intervening half hour. There were visible tissue marks on his sleeve. One of his lawyers tried to hand him a notepad, perhaps to take notes for a rebuttal, but he didn't take it. The presentation continued, moving into what was labeled Phase 3, the monetization of royal pain. These messages discussed which childhood memories still had shelf life. Meghan had written to her friend about whether to include certain traumas in her podcast or save them for her book. She wrote, "Don't waste it all on the first product. Harry's got layers." The abandonment arc still hasn't been fully tapped. She referred to his childhood trauma as an abandonment arc, as if his life were a television series with multiple seasons to exploit. Another message read, "We need to get a clip of him saying something about the Queen's corgis. Nostalgia is pure engagement." By this point, Harry was no longer reacting to individual messages. His hands were limp, his eyes fixed on the edge of the witness box, his breathing shallow. The only signs of consciousness were the slight twitches of his jaw and the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The courtroom evidence was methodically organized into 3 distinct categories: monetization, family manipulation, and emotional exploitation. The first category revealed exchanges spanning late 2022 to summer 2024. These weren't scandalous in tone, but strategic in structure, reading like branding memos dressed up as personal correspondence. One message broke down revenue streams tied to specific emotional narratives. The Diana legacy was labeled as Halo. William was labeled as unresolved tension. Catherine was labeled as comparison vector. Charles was labeled as redemption thread if ever needed. Their Netflix contract was described in one text as our pension vehicle. Meghan wrote that they needed to stretch the royal trauma arc across at least 3 projects to ensure long-term cash flow, using the phrase trauma fatigue pacing to describe how to time disclosures so the public wouldn't get bored. Then came the merchandising strategies. There were discussions of a children's brand featuring royal resilience themes, a plush toy line called Archie Bears, and a motivational picture book tied to their daughter's name. Most shocking was a note labeled Crisis Capital, detailing how to pivot negative press into higher engagement by framing it as bullying or colonial backlash. One line, highlighted in bold on the courtroom screen, read, "We don't run from scandals. We alchemize them." What had been presented publicly as organic and vulnerable now looked painfully transactional to everyone in the room. This was not a couple struggling to find their way. This was a corporation maximizing its assets, and Harry was the prime asset. The realization that his family feuds were being charted on a graph for profitability must have been the final indignity. If the first category undercut the Sussex brand, the second detonated its moral foundation. These messages revealed how Meghan viewed the royal family not as relatives, but as players in a long-term negotiation. Prince William was identified as the real threat due to his polished anger and institutional loyalty. Meghan noted he was less emotional than Harry, more dangerous because of it, and disturbing to watch. Catherine was given a nickname that made the courtroom gasp, the uncrackable mask. Meghan expressed frustration that no attempts to provoke a public reaction had succeeded. She speculated about Catherine's mental health, marriage, and parenting style, using phrases so cruel that journalists struggled to quote them directly in their reports. She wrote, "If she cracks in public even once, it shifts the whole narrative." But she's colder than marble. This revealed a premeditated campaign to break the Princess of Wales, using mental health accusations as a siege weapon. More unsettling were messages about King Charles, described as sentimental and weak in the right light. Meghan suggested he could be used for public reconciliation if they ever needed to soften the brand, adding that his guilt over Diana could be a lever if pulled properly. But perhaps most emotionally devastating were references to Archie and Lilibet. Meghan wrote, "We'll decide later how Windsor we want them to appear. Titles matter, but not as much as optics." The phrase optics, weighed against the royal blood of her own children, was a crushing blow. It revealed a transactional view of motherhood that stood in stark contrast to the protective image she cultivated publicly. It suggested that the children were not just loved, they were leveraged. The final category was the deepest cut, not because it exposed cruelty, but because it revealed coldness. These messages were exclusively about Harry, his vulnerabilities, his traumas, his inner world, and how to shape them. Meghan recounted a therapy session Harry attended, writing, "He opened up about the tunnel dream again, said he keeps seeing his mother's face before the crash. I told him to write it down. Could be powerful, open to something bigger." The phrase "something bigger" implied grief transformed into content. There were discussions cataloging Harry's night terrors, his fear of helicopters, his guilt, his shame, all indexed like database entries, commodities to be traded on the open market. But one message silenced the entire courtroom, bringing the proceedings to a standstill. Meghan wrote, "He said he misses his brother. I told him that's just memory, not reality." That nostalgia lies. Had to redirect fast. He was drifting. Redirect fast. This wasn't communication. It was control. It was emotional re-steering, the careful trimming of human connection to ensure he remained isolated. It was the technique of a handler managing an asset, not a wife supporting a husband. Harry's face, as this was read, was ashen and motionless. He didn't protest. He didn't cry. He just stared. And then came the final blow, read slowly and quietly by Judge Thornberry. Harry's love for them is a vulnerability. If we don't manage it, it will derail everything. Not his love for me, not our love for each other, but his love for them, his family, his past, his identity. As the courtroom sat in stunned silence, it became devastatingly clear that these messages hadn't just destroyed a narrative. They had revealed a machine, a mechanism for controlling perception, emotions, and people, with Harry at the center not as a prince or a husband, but as a tool. The moment the courtroom adjourned, the institutional silence began to crack. The palace's official response was characteristically restrained, but it came from Clarence House, from King Charles himself. It read, "This is a difficult time for all families. Some matters are best resolved privately and with compassion." Behind closed doors, sources described the king as calm but drained. According to a senior courtier, his first words after reading the transcripts were, "This is not vengeance, this is gravity." He issued one quiet instruction. The household must remain disciplined. No gloating, no leaking, no vindictive statements. This is not a victory, it is a collapse. What hurt Charles most wasn't the damage to the institution, but the portrayal of his son as a pawn, a project, a walking brand strategy with trauma as currency. Prince William burned in silence. Those close to him described him as furious, not at Meghan, but at Harry for letting her do this, for handing them over. When William read the message labeling Catherine the uncrackable mask, he went completely silent, then reportedly said she was trying to break her. The realization that the attacks on his wife were not emotional outbursts but calculated attempts to provoke a breakdown hardened William's resolve against any future reconciliation. Within 48 hours, the world had picked sides. But here is what made this different from previous royal controversies. Even Meghan's most ardent supporters found themselves speechless. In the United Kingdom, public opinion didn't just shift. It avalanched. Polls showed Harry's sympathy ratings dropped to the lowest level since his departure from royal life, viewed now not as a rebel but as a dupe. Meghan's approval plunged even further, with some polls placing her favorability in the single digits. But the United States, where the couple had found refuge and support, told a more complex story. Morning shows that had once championed their courage now featured panels of psychologists analyzing manipulation tactics. Editorials in major newspapers spoke not just of betrayal of family, but betrayal of trust with the public who had believed their narrative. The American media, which values authenticity above all, began to turn on the inauthentic nature of the Sussex brand. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like Harry deserves better trended alongside Meghan exposed. TikTok exploded with therapists breaking down the messages, identifying patterns of gaslighting and emotional control. Instagram influencers who had posted supportive content began quietly deleting old posts to avoid association. Corporate sponsors felt the heat immediately. A streaming platform executive was quoted anonymously saying, "We bought a memoir, not a manipulation manual." Several brands quietly distanced themselves from Sussex-related projects, and endorsement deals entered what one insider called indefinite review. The commercial viability of the Sussex brand, which relied on authenticity, had been poisoned. Mental health professionals who analyzed the courtroom footage and message content identified something crucial. This wasn't just about public embarrassment. Harry was experiencing what therapists call reality dissolution. It is the moment when your entire understanding of your life story gets rewritten by someone else. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a trauma specialist who spoke to multiple news outlets, explained that when someone you love uses your deepest wounds as strategic tools, it doesn't just hurt your feelings, it fractures your sense of reality. Harry is discovering that moments he thought were genuine connection were actually performances he was directed to give. The messages about Diana were particularly devastating from a psychological perspective. Harry had spent decades processing his mother's death, seeking therapy, opening up publicly about his struggles. To discover that these sacred moments had been optimized for engagement was, according to experts, a form of psychological violence. Dr. Mitchell noted, "It's one thing to be betrayed. It's another to discover you were never actually living your own life. You were starring in someone else's production." Perhaps most disturbing were the quiet revelations about what palace insiders had suspected all along. Multiple sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that senior royals had noticed troubling patterns years earlier. One former aide recalled a conversation with Prince William in early 2020, where he said, "My brother speaks differently now. He uses words that don't sound like him. It's like someone's written a script and he's reading it back." Catherine had apparently noticed it too. Friends described her frustration at watching Harry and Meghan's interviews, recognizing phrases and anecdotes that Harry had once told differently, now repackaged with new emotional emphasis and different conclusions. King Charles, ever the diplomat, had tried to bridge the gap, but according to insiders, even he had expressed concern to trusted advisors, saying, "I don't recognize my son's voice anymore. The words are his, but the message feels manufactured." The tragedy, these sources noted, was that no one could say anything without sounding paranoid or controlling. How do you tell someone their wife is manipulating them without destroying any remaining relationship? How do you prove that authentic emotion is being weaponized? You don't. You wait. You hope they see it themselves. and you prepare for the moment when the truth inevitably surfaces. That moment came in a London courtroom with devastating precision, vindicating the family's silence while breaking their hearts. It was the confirmation of their worst fears. Harry hadn't just left, he had been taken. Amid all the courtroom drama and global reaction, two young children became the story's most heartbreaking footnote. Archie and Lilibet, referenced in their mother's messages as branding opportunities and optics, now represented something far more complicated: innocent casualties of adult warfare. Legal experts began speculating about custody implications. If Harry chose to leave, or if the marriage collapsed under the weight of these revelations, where would the children live? British law, American law, royal protocol, and international custody agreements would collide in unprecedented ways. Royal historians noted that never before had the custody of children with royal blood been determined in American courts. The complications were staggering: dual citizenship, security protocols, titles, education, cultural identity. More painfully, sources close to Harry revealed his deepest fear: that his children were being raised in the same manufactured environment he just discovered he'd been living in. Were Archie's milestones being documented for authentic family memories or for content calendars? Were Lilibet's first words cherished moments or engagement opportunities? The messages had planted seeds of doubt about everything. And for a father trying to give his children the authentic childhood he never had, those doubts were torture. The question of whether his children were being loved for who they are or for what they represent is the cruelest question a parent can face. Public sentiment began shifting, not away from Harry entirely, but towards something unexpected: pity. Millions watched the courtroom footage. Millions saw the shaking hands, the blotchy face, the silence of a man undone. Mental health experts weighed in, noting signs of gaslighting, codependency, and trauma manipulation. Suddenly, a new narrative emerged: not Harry the betrayer, but Harry the betrayed. King Charles has reportedly communicated through intermediaries that Harry would be welcomed back to the UK privately, quietly, without cameras, not as a working royal, but as a son in need. The message was clear: the institution has rules, but a father has none. Even Catherine, hurt though she is, believes the children deserve connection to their roots. Only William remains silent. His wounds are different, sharper, deeper. The betrayal between brothers isn't constitutional, it's personal. Harry now faces three paths, each fraught with peril. He can stay, rebuild, and renegotiate, trying to forgive the person who may have rewritten his life story, living in the cage he helped build. He can leave, divorce, disengage, and fight for custody and identity across the Atlantic in a war that would be even more public than this trial, risking everything he has left. Or he can return, come back to the UK, to a family still reeling, to a public still uncertain, to an institution that may offer comfort but never forgets. Each path carries a price, each demands sacrifice, but only one offers truth. And after everything, after the tears, the transcripts, the trauma, truth is what Harry may now crave most of all. Because in the end, no matter how far a prince travels, no matter how many crowns he walks away from, he is still a son, he is still a brother, and perhaps someday soon, he might be ready to come home. The question isn't whether the door is still open. The question is whether Harry has the strength to walk through it, leaving the script behind and finding the courage to speak his own lines for the first time in years.